Hi guys, my name is Swapnil and the title of my talk is What the Tech. It's about innovation and the spirit of collaboration in computer science and where we can get to if we kind of bear those principles in mind. So some of the stuff I'm going to talk to you about today is stuff that's left me saying like, wow, this is incredible, how does it work? It's stuff that to me sometimes, especially because I don't understand all of it that well, feels like magic. You're like, this is incredible. Like, how are people, just like me, able to come up with this stuff? It inspires me certainly to become better, and it inspires me to make a difference because these are things, technologies that do make a difference. I'm sorry about using the word stuff. It's just lazy, but what else do you use? You know, things, stuff. What do you replace that with? But first, so this is a computer. Does anyone know? And if you don't know, please put your hands and volunteer. If you drill down to the very basic level of a computer, what's going on? What's moving around? How are we getting to basically a computer that you can click and move things about and watch things?
Transistors on and off.
And what's in the transistors? Like what's flowing around? Yeah, electrical currents, right? How crazy is that? That from electrical currents, just two things, ones and zeros, you get to something that you can see an image, you can play a video game, you could watch a video. Anything you do with a computer is ones and zeros. Right? To me, that's kind of like magic, isn't it? It's absolutely amazing. And it's sort of similar like language. You've only got 26 letters in the alphabet. Or with music, you've only got some number of notes, but you can put those in so many different combinations and come up with some really cool, incredible stuff that's very powerful and capable of doing so much. But first, a bit about me and my journey. So I've had a multicultural upbringing. I was born in India. I did all my primary schooling in Uganda and then all my secondary schooling here, and I'm actually an ex-MGGSer for sixth form. I did philosophy at an undergraduate level. Then I was a religious studies and philosophy teacher for a few years. And then I was like, okay, I want to get into computer science. What's going to be the best option for me? And that was doing a master's, but it was a conversion course. It was specifically designed for people who had come from different backgrounds. It's a one-year master's course. I just finished it, passed, thankfully. And as part of that, I also was lucky enough to get an internship at Reflect with Mike as my mentor. And that was really useful as well, because it gave me a chance, again, to actually work on projects, apply some of the things I'd learned, and also learn a bunch of new different things. And that quote at the end is not my quote, but it does describe me. I'm very extroverted, and I need my existence to be acknowledged once in a while. So clap and say nice things at the end, otherwise I'll be really sad. But why did I want to get into computer science? I wanted to make a difference, right? So technology informs all aspects of our life today. And I was like, I can see that it has capability to do so much. It's so powerful. And I felt like if I could get involved in that, if I could learn how to program, understand these technologies, I was able to be involved in that conversation and hopefully use what I learned to make a difference. And even if it's very small, I wanted to feel like I was contributing in some way. And that's only going to get like more of a, not an issue, but it's going to become more prominent as time goes on. Life becomes more and more technology focused. So I wanted to have a say in that conversation. So there's three images here. Can you figure out what the word, it's two words, I'll give you a clue. What two words am I kind of hinting at here that are going to be the focus of my talk? They didn't get this in the last one, but any ideas? I don't know, what do you call this? Do you know? Where you have to guess the word from the pictures. There must be a word for it. But any ideas? Yeah. So the first one's O. No, oh my God. But I can see why you think that. Okay, so we've got O. I heard someone say. Open, and then open source. Did someone say source? Yeah. So I'm talking about open source technologies because this is a pen, and the idea is this is a source of a river. Anyone know any examples of open source technologies? So if you don't. Yeah, Linux, and that's actually the first thing I'm going to talk about. But first, let's get to that little demonstration for which I asked the 6 volunteers. So we're going to look at this question, right? Pretend this question, what is the ultimate smoothie recipe, is like really, really important. And if we crack that recipe, we're going to change people's lives for the better around the world. We're not, but just imagine for the purposes of demonstrating the spirit of open source. So I have my 6 volunteers. they have the answer, partially, some of them. So if you can remember who went out, just put your hands up if you went out and you know a word or something. So these guys, I want everyone else to ask them and try and piece together the information about what makes the ultimate smoothie. I'm going to give you 10 seconds for the first round. Off you go. Quickly, let's have a conversation. Can't remember. Okay, so first round, what happened? Right, okay. What's your name here? Yeah. What did he say when you spoke to? He doesn't know, right? Who else had that experience? If you ask someone and they said, I don't know, right? So that's frustrating. Imagine you're trying to figure out this really important problem and you know someone else has the information, they can help you, but they say, I don't know. They don't want to collaborate. Let's try again now. Ask these guys the same question. Let's see, there's going to be 4 items for the ultimate smoothie recipe. What are they? Same thing. Off you go. And you're going to need to speak across your columns as well. So someone on this side asks this side and vice versa, share the information. Okay, so let's bring it back now. I don't think anyone got the full picture, but what 4 items did anyone hear across the 2 sides? Banana, apple, yogurt. Anything else? Kale. Anything else? Strawberry. Okay, so we had 5 items, and I said there's 4. So what happened? These are the 4. So if you got kale, strawberries, bananas, and yogurt, that's the ultimate smoothie recipe. It's probably not. It probably tastes horrible. But with you guys sharing the information between each other, and maybe if I'd given you a bit more time, you would have arrived at that conclusion. So you've got a solution by working with each other, sharing and collaborating. But notice someone said apple, and apple's not on there. So that reflects what could happen in reality. And most of the time, you'll actually find with people working in open source, they're willing to collaborate. But sometimes you'll get a couple of situations. You might get someone who's still not willing to share, and you might get someone who actually gives you false information. Okay, and that's completely the antithesis of what open source is about. It's about being transparent, free, and collaborative. By transparent, I mean that whatever technology, whatever code you're using is publicly visible to anyone who wants to access it without having to pay anything or go through some sort of arduous process. It has to be free in 2 senses of the word. You don't have to pay for it, and you're free to use it however you want. So there's no sort of restrictions, and that's like kind of the core of open source. And then collaborative, it has to be a collaborative project. It has to be open for people to make additions, make changes, and kind of use it as they see fit. And then you've got this interesting quote, which explains why open source is important, because we have all this data about us, we have all this information, we have all these technologies that we can't see how they work. We can't see what sort of information companies like Amazon, like Google, like Facebook store about us. But that's important because it's about us and it could potentially impact us. But we've got these closed walls where we can't actually see what's going on. And so we're losing objectivity. We're open to people manipulating us. We're open to people having a say in our lives without actually having control of what they can say and what they can do with information about us. And we've seen this come to the fore in the last few years with things like Cambridge Analytica and the whole allegations of Russian involvement in the US election, etc. Because there's so much data that these organizations have about us and they can use that data. So the idea behind open source is all that becomes transparent, all that becomes open, and we can have a say about what information people hold about us. So as someone rightly said, the first kind of open source technology I want to look at is Linux. This is a message sent out by the creator of Linux. His name is Linus, and he's talking about this free operating system that he wants to create, which is based on an operating system that existed at the time called Minix. And he basically had an issue with it, and he wanted to add extra functionality. which wasn't part of their operating system. So he said, you know, I know how to do it. I'm going to make it on my own. And he's letting people know what he's doing, and he's asking people for suggestions. And from that, this was in the date there, you've got 91. From 91 to today, we're now at this point where Linux is a huge, huge piece of work. It's the largest open source project in the world. It has over 7 changes per hour, so that's over 1,000 a week. And those changes are not done by one person or by one organization. Everyone who has the capability, as long as they follow the guidelines, is able to make contributions to what Linux should look like and what should go into Linux and what shouldn't go into Linux. And if you really disagree with that, you can use that code and make your own version because it's free. You're free to use it how you want. There's no restrictions. And a lot of people do that. You'll find that there'll be an existing code base and then it splits because there's disagreements on how to move forward. It powers all of the top 500 fastest supercomputers in the world. Okay, so just because it's free doesn't mean that it's not stable, it's not capable, it's not powerful. There's a reason that people in charge of these supercomputers have decided to use Linux because they feel it's the best solution for whatever they're trying to achieve with their supercomputers. And these things are hugely, hugely capable, right? For example, at the Large Hadron Collider in CERN, everyone know what that is, the LHC? So when you have the particle collisions, one collision generates about a petabyte of data. Okay, so to give you context, a terabyte is 1,000 gigabytes and a petabyte is 1,000 terabytes. That's huge quantities of data, and that's being fed into a machine powered by Linux to be processed. Okay, so it comes back to how important it is in terms of being capable, but also then powering things that are giving us insight into the way the world works. And later on, we're going to see also that are making an impact in changing the quality of people's lives. And then many of your smartphones, if you have an Android smartphone, also based on Linux. But the difference is that's someone taken the Linux code, making differences so that it's no longer the same, and then they've made it closed source. So you can't access it in the same way you'd be able to access the original Linux code base. And then we come back to some of what Mike was saying about websites around the world. The 2 most used web servers, Apache and Nginx, are Linux-based. They can run on Windows servers, but most of them are running on Linux servers. So over 60% of the websites that you visit, including things like Facebook, Instagram, etc., social media, are going to be being served to you by Linux servers. If you look at what Tim Berners-Lee, the father of modern World Wide Web, did in order to set up the kind of infrastructure of the web as you know it, all of that, HTML, for example, which Mike mentioned, was his creation. And he made it open. He made it free, and now it's controlled by a body that just decides basically how it should progress, but anyone is free to make input into that about the future of HTML and what it can and can't do. But let's look at a specific example. So Linux kind of used in so many different settings, but one specific thing, this project called Missing Maps, which is about helping those in a crisis. And again, it's using the open source kind of principles of free, transparent, and collaborative in order to make a difference to those who are suffering in a crisis. So it's created by these organizations, MSF, the Red Cross, American and British, and a few more, and it uses an open source technology called OpenStreetmap. And the founder of OpenStreetmap was finding that to access map data for different areas around the world, it was very difficult because a lot of it was licensed and held by certain providers who own satellite imagery, etc., and you had to pay huge amounts of money. So that data wasn't easily accessible, so he started his own project, OpenStreetmap, and now all the data that's on there is freely available for you to use, and you can also then look at it and say if there's any mistakes, any changes you think need to be made, you can have input into that. And it's used by Missing Maps to help get an understanding of what the geography of an area that suffered from something like an earthquake or flooding or hurricane, what the geography looks like and how you can use an understanding of that area to give aid to people who need it the most, quickest. So in the last 2 years, since 2017 when the project started, 10,000 people have made contributions, which includes 22 million edits. Just in 2 years, 22 million edits, 3 million buildings and 300,000 kilometers of roads. And from that, you've got other projects that have sprung forth. Okay, so again, this spirit of collaboration using existing technology. And one's called MapSwipe, where you can sort of do the same thing. You can look at satellite imagery and say, okay, this is a good quality image, this is not so good because there's clouds over it, so you can't actually see the land underneath, or there's buildings here, so this is something worth investigating. And that's an app on your phone that you could spend 5 minutes a day just swiping through, so you're feeding into the data that Missing Maps then uses to help improve the lives of people in a crisis. So a specific example, this is the map data generated by the organization for Zimbabwe, and it basically gives you an idea of the condition of the building and then the building materials as well. And in this context, it's used by the Red Cross in Zimbabwe to identify if an area is at risk of flooding, which this is an area that's at risk of flooding, which houses are going to need the help first, because they're, for example, made from concrete, and if you mix water and concrete, the stability of the structure is reduced. Without that information, they just know there's a flood that's hit this area. They just have to make educated guesses about which area is going to need help first. And then in a situation like this where time is critical, that might mean actually the difference between being able to save 1,000 people as opposed to being able to save 5,000 if you have more information. And that's quite simple, right? That's using satellite imagery to just say, there's a building here, there's not a building here, there's a road here, this is what exists here. Can we, with that information, find out people who have insight about the area to say what's the quality of the building, what's the building material, etc. It's not nothing kind of revolutionary in terms of using amazing technology that's like right the cutting edge, but it's making a difference, and it's open source. Open source maps. Let me just finish my sentence, then I'll get to you. Open source maps and people willing to make input and collaborate on getting that data as accurate and as up to date as it can be. Yes.
What's to stop a bunch of like people, a massive group, to go into that and just mess around, just to mess it around because they can?
Yeah. So the way a lot of open source works now is you have kind of committees that will. And there'll be committees with people from different organizations. You haven't got one organization in control. You've got lots of different input. And the reason it doesn't happen is because ultimately what you find is in open source, people do care. So we could all go, we could go on Wikipedia and edit a bunch of different pages and put false information. And you do find that, don't you? You'll go on someone's profile and you're like, this doesn't seem right. And it does happen, it's false information. But eventually someone comes along, realizes there's a mistake and changes it back. And so in open source, especially with the really big projects, you've got millions and millions of people who are making inputs. And so it's just, I think it's deep down that desire to be good. And that's what open source is kind of relying on. Yeah, you're outnumbered basically. And in theory you could, if everyone involved in a project decided to misuse it, it would be possible. But then that does happen. So it's, with closed source, so it's a similar situation. And today it hasn't been a big issue in open source technology. Linux has been around for so long, and it would be so easy to change the code. And people do try and make bad changes, but other people always rectify the changes. But that's a good question. If you look at AI, for example, anyone seen The Good Place? So in the future, you might imagine an AI to behave kind of like Janet does in The Good Place. And at the moment, we're not kind of there yet. And AI, as we know it at the moment, is just really complicated maths, but it can do so much. Hello? So, for example, Google Assistant, automated cars, and use in medical industry, a lot of those are using open source code bases. So something called Tensorflow, which is an AI framework library. So as Mike was saying, it's existing code that we could use to create an AI or use to make a project without having to write necessarily our own code or just make small edits, has been used to do some amazing things. Not just like the assistants, the automated cars, but it's been used for breast cancer detection, to get an earlier diagnosis of people with breast cancer, so you're more likely to be able to give them the treatment they need. It's been used for earthquake detection and aftershock detection. So again, knowing if an area is safe to go into after an earthquake makes a big difference between being able to save someone's lives and not. It's also used open source technology in encryption. So the app on the left, the logo, that's for Signal, which is like a messenger similar to WhatsApp, but it's all open source. I can go look at the code and I can know if they're sending the data back to an organization selling my information to someone else, which is a big problem that people have with WhatsApp. The data is going back to Facebook because it's owned by Facebook and it's used for the advertising. You don't know what they're doing with the data, but with open source, because it's transparent, any one of us can have a look and figure out whether it's being used for good or bad. And these things like Signal were used with whistleblowing to keep their identity secret and keep them safe. So Edward Snowden was using Signal to communicate. He was sending encrypted emails, which were using open source encryption. Panama Papers, journalists involved in that and the whistleblowers using open source encryption to communicate safely and leak this information, which has changed, maybe not as much as you would hope, but it has changed the way people approach the understanding of their data on the internet, etc. And hopefully we're all more aware about it. So all these things, innovating, but it's also really important to have that transparency, to have that openness, and to give people the ability to use the technology however they want. And you come back to this quote, that objectivity and the knowledge and understanding we have, you don't want it to be controlled by people who have their own agendas. You want it to be free out there in the open in terms of how is it being used, and more importantly, how you get to have a say in how your data, your information about you and your life is used. Any questions? Thank you very much for listening.